so glad to be in this room because I feel like there's really good residual on this stage right now from the conversation that we just had that was more global in nature. But as the earlier panel reminded us, like all theology is rooted in a place. And so during this session, we're going to talk about that. So we're going to discuss models of embodied evangelism, what that looks like in our local context in Greater Pasadena, and really challenging these Western paradigms that we're kind of looking at over the course of these 3 days, the approaches, practices, and we're looking at models that prioritize the most marginalized people in a community and that center the whole person, the whole community on the whole land. Before we get started, though, and Pastor Gina is going to be joining us in just a moment, and I promise she's worth the wait. But before we do that, I want to just acknowledge that in this moment, we stand on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded land of the Tongva Gabrielino Band of Mission Indians. We acknowledge the relocation, enslavement, forced conversions to Christianity, and other horrific harms of colonization endured by the Tongva, including harms that continue to this day. The Tongva are a beautiful and strong people who endured, survived, and are still here. We are indebted to them for their hospitality, generosity, and example of creation stewardship. Let us be grateful for them, be willing to learn from them, and ensure their truth is known by us and future generations. My name is Mayra Macedo-Nolan, and I'm going to just be moderating. You're going to hear from some really amazing people. Pastor Jean, welcome. I was a pastor at a large church nearby for about 20 years. I also chair the board of the Christian Community Development Association, CCDA, kind of for way too long. I'll be wrapping that up this coming year. It's been a privilege, absolutely. And the CCDA is an organization, it's national, focused on strengthening and connecting people who are doing community development in communities all over the US, but even globally. So if you want to learn more about CCDA, you can check us out at ccda.org. I left my role as a pastor of a local church to lead the Clergy Community Coalition, and that's kind of how we formed this panel today. The CCC envisions a flourishing community where the church is mobilized to seek the well-being of the city through collaborative partnerships and strategic relationships. And we cultivate this beloved community by gathering and developing and mobilizing community leaders. And by leaders, I mean like clergy and like the top leaders of nonprofits and the city. That's who we gather in the room together. And we do that for the flourishing of all of our neighbors, every part of our community, not just one part. We're a coalition of clergy, civic leaders, nonprofit leaders, for impact leaders. We gather regularly for sharing, perspective taking, and strategic collaboration towards a more just Greater Pasadena. And we currently focus our outward witness on a few areas: housing justice, which we're going to talk about today, education equity, and public safety and just policing. And in addition to that outer witness, we really spend a lot of time curating and cultivating community amongst clergy because we know pastoring ain't easy. And we really want people to be healthy because healthy churches can lead to healthy community. We gather these people every month, and the question that we hear most often is, how do you do that? Like, how did you get all these people into the same room, and how do you keep doing it over and over again, and they actually want to be here? So it's all God. We just kind of set the table and people come, and it's really amazing. I'm not minimizing that because actually there was a lot of hard relational work put into that before I ever showed up in the room. And Pastor Jean, who you'll hear from, was the founding president of the Clergy Community Coalition. So we really have a treat for you today. Some really amazing leaders who have been doing great work and leading churches in this community. And also they're all Fuller alums. So let's give them a welcome. And I'm going to, yes. And I would like you all to take a minute and introduce yourself. So we'll just go down the row.
Okay, I can do that. Good morning to all of you. So glad to see you all. I'm Pastor Jean Burch, and I have lived in Pasadena ever since I was 3 years old. I said just a few moments ago, I've lived here long enough to see the African-American population go from 20% to 8%. So there's a lot of story, a lot of history here. and I'm happy to be here. I'm also a trustee on the Fuller Trustee Board. Yeah. And as Mayra said, the founding president of the CCC. And I am just really happy to be here this afternoon. Is it morning? Is it still morning? This morning. Yeah.
It's been a long day.
It's been a long day already. Yes. Okay. Jill?
Is this working? Oh, good. My name is Jill Shook. I try to shake things up a bit. And those of you that know me, they know that's true. And I'm so glad to be here today with you. I had the privilege of studying under Dr. Ray Bakke. Some of you know him. So that's a doctor of ministry and transformational leadership for the global city. And then that has really enabled me to think globally about cities. So you'll be hearing a little bit about that in my sharing today. I'm also the co-founding director of Making Housing and Community Happen. That's the name of our nonprofit. We do housing justice work in the city of Pasadena and beyond. We've now expanded to Texas, Colorado, Washington, and Northern California. And we're doing one-day housing justice institutes around the country. So we have a small staff of 5 people. We're doing mighty things. God is awesome. Thank you.
Buenos días, buenas tardes. Pastor Marcos Canales from La Fuente Ministries. We just celebrated 10 years of this community of discípulos y discípulas de Cristo that are committed to bilingual, intergenerational, intercultural life that allow us to really just collaborate with all of the ongoing justice-related work here locally, but also transnationally in reflecting our Latinidad, our way of diverse way of being part of the Latinx community, connects us also with what happens in south of the border and at the border and within the invisible borders that are even within our community here. So I'm very thankful for this community, some of whose members are here, and just all the leaders, and also just as another note, which I think it's related somehow. I'm just very thankful. I just got back from a sabbatical, and as a brown-skinned pastor, we're trying to resist so that we can re-exist, as Profe has taught us so much, right? Because it's not common for us brown pastors, Latino pastors, to stop and trust God. So that also influences who we are and what we do. So I'm very thankful for rest as resistance and rest as a way to continue to do this amazing work with all these leaders here locally.
Thank you, Pastor. So today we're going to kind of focus on three chunks, 3 movements. And so first, we're going to take a look at the big picture and some of the history of this local area. And then we're going to hear some contextualization and some resistance story. And then we're going to hear about advocacy. And you'll see how they all flow together. But we're going to start with Pastor Marcos. And you're going to be laying the foundation for us. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm gonna try to do this. I don't know if I can, but I'll try to paint some broad, just context setting, right? Pastor Mayra already acknowledged the Tongva people here, and the land and the way that they were relating to the land. So I think for us to speak about evangelism, for us to speak about the local expression of evangelism and justice here in Pasadena, we have to do the hard work of a theology of the land, and have a way of questioning any evangelism methodology, product, or conference that presupposes a domineering over the land. And to do that hard work of a theology of the land that is embodied versus disembodied is actually the essence of the kind of work that we're going to be talking about. So I think Dr. Tisby, yesterday you mentioned, right? History doesn't repeat itself. It has echo, or it rhymes. It rhymes, right? So let me walk you a little bit back in history, because I love history too. And so it echoes this way. The Tongva people lived as tribal, right? And in free movement. If you look at maps of that time, the tribal peoples and the people groups of the Tongva people just moved around this whole area as subsistence and gathering and everything else, right? We fast forward to early European settler colonialism. So once they start arriving, then there's a different relationship to the land, so that it's not just mobile and more porous, the movement around the land, but there's actually an intent for parcels to be made, for the concept of how do we protect certain spaces as our land. Then you have actual Iberian Peninsula colonialism, which is Portugal and Spain, which come with a divine mandate and a divine permission from papal bulls, right? From papal decrees saying, oh, you get this land, and Spanish, you get this land, Portuguese, you get this land. And rooted within that, to back up that kind of domineering of land and relationship to the land, there are theologies of violence that support that. There's a reading, and perhaps you could say a misreading, of Genesis 1, right? You're all with me still? Yes? And actually, I believe there was another session yesterday too on male patriarchy and all of the mess that Aristotle did, right? That also influenced doctrine of discovery, but even before that, theologies of violence, in which anybody that was living in a land that was not rational, that did not have a language, that didn't have governance, that didn't have Christian faith, specifically Catholic faith, was considered a barbarian. Yes? So then when Spanish colonial times arrives here, then there's the intent of let's control the land, but let's also evangelize the land. And let's create missions. And so Junipero Serra begins that whole movement. And in fact, Misión San Gabriel, which is down the street from here, is the mission that gets created to civilize all the Tongva people. And everything around here revolves around Misión San Gabriel. You see how that relationship of sword, cross, and crown begin to relate to land as domineering. But that's not all. Then there's an independence movement and the Mexican state begins to arise. So there's the concept of a nation state beginning to emerge, and the criollos revolt against the Spanish crown. And if you know anything, criollos is part of one of the castas, which is a racial hierarchy that gets, I'm sorry, I'm talking too fast. I forgot about our translators. I apologize, whoever's translating. Let's take, they're catching up.
Take a breath. Take a breath.
Okay. So then, I don't even know what I was saying. Criollos, thank you. So this is before the race construct was created in the US. Spanish theology and social constructs created castas, racial categories, which brought about racial hierarchy. Again, to justify how do we continue to civilize the indigenous people here and people that were below the criollos, right? Because the criollos were the leaders of founding a nation state. So then what happens is they take away the land from the Catholic Church and they start giving it away to people, including women, including indigenous women in this area. And here I'm leaning heavily on Roberta Martinez, who has written a history of Latinos in Pasadena. And she says, I want you to remember this name, Eulalia Pérez de Guillén. Eulalia Pérez de Guillén was she held the keys to Misión San Gabriel. She took care of Misión San Gabriel. So when it became a nation, or began the foundation of a nation state of the Mexican independence, the Mexican governor gives Eulalia Pérez de Guillén 14,000 acres to thank her for all her work of 12 years in Misión San Gabriel. That was Rancho San Pascual, which included Pasadena, San Marino, parts of La Cañada, Sierra Madre, and South Pass. Wow. She was... All of those were reserved for her. But then the Mexican-American War comes and U.S. expansionism and another form of colonialism, right? Settler colonialism. And what happens then is that instead of keeping those same Mexican laws, there's new USA laws. And in 1851, there's the Land Act Trust, or the Land Act law, which actually makes it unlawful for women to own land. And here we can make a direct correlation to Aristotle and Greek philosophers. If you see women in the bottom of the hierarchy, closer to the land, and if you already have a theology that dominates and domineers land, it is just one step ahead to domineer bodies that are not male. Am I making sense? Mm-hmm. Or this just too? Okay, so you can extract the right to own land from women because they're just as close to the land, and so you're just going to take over. And in fact, many of the people that were here then are not necessarily granted U.S. citizenship, which later on gets enacted again by the so-called Repatriation Act, which is just massive deportations. And so Pasadena's Latino population dwindles. So Roberta Martinez says that in about 50 years, Alta y Baja California was impacted by the history of the United States of Mexico and the United States of America. In a span of 50 years, less than 3 generations, those living in Alta California, Alta California is this high California, by the way. Alta California were part of 4 social systems and 3 different governments: Spanish, Mexican, and the United States of America. But all of them under the premise of rhyming with, we're going to domineer the land. And if we have that behind us, if we have a theology of violence that reads Genesis as, now you have dominion, then you can do whatever you want, especially as you otherize people, right? So we bring all of this up because I feel that the rhyming of history then gets overlaid with redlining. And so the same pockets of land that the U.S. government said, okay, if you're of Mexican descent, you can only live in the northwest part of Pasadena. We don't have the map, but that's for reals. South of Pasadena, there's a commercial district there. That's where you can be. And then east, it's a very rural area. And we're going to name that Chihuahuita. And you can hang out there. Chihuahuita then later on gets to what we now Hastings Ranch. But Hastings Ranch is Chihuahuita. You see? And in fact, we meet in Chihuahuita because we're trying to say, hey, this ain't Hastings Ranch. This can't be a 2.5 million home and exclude people. This used to be the people that built freeways and harvested all of Orange Grove, hello, lived here. So I feel like for us as pastors in this community, our call is to not only just have a theology of the land, but it's to redignify the land, for dignity of the land. Because if we can dignify the land, our indigenous Latin American people, la madre tierra, if we can relate to our mother earth with dignity, then we are reformed and reshaped and reinstructed so that then I can relate with women with dignity. Does that make sense? Am I explaining myself? But if we, and scripture has so much personification of the land. Mountains and the land and the rocks crying out. But we just love the metaphor of it versus the actual beckoning and calling that Mother Earth, land, is a being that we can relate to so that our beloved community relationships can actually be restored. And that's where the justice work for us as local pastors begins. If we don't know that history, we can easily be like, I'm a church plant. Oh, the church plant people are, no, sorry. I'm just gonna win Pasadena for Christ. See that language? Loaded with colonial settler, right? And our brand, our church is gonna save this place. And we're gonna buy land. So I keep telling, especially my Latina pastors, like all of that fund for a building fund, because we all love building funds, right? You're gonna use it up so quickly by buying something that could actually help this community flourish. And Hebrews says we are strangers and immigrants in this land, in search and in longing for the New Jerusalem. So what would it look like if our building funds actually become justice funds, flourishing funds, land funds for our neighbors? See how it all... Sorry, I took more time. I apologize. I will not say anything else.
This, and either one of them can talk to us for an hour and we would be soaking it all up because it's so good. And I think I just had the hardest job in this whole missiology lecture is to try to like moderate this panel. And it's so good, obviously, right? You were like, I saw you, how you were like hanging on the edge of your seat. But this is so important, laying the foundation. So the CCC is a clergy space that really does have an open door and a welcome. And anybody who is a church planter and newer in the city will tell you, like, I found my home and my community at the Clergy Community Coalition, which is really interesting because for me as a community developer person, my theology, like, church planting is kind of the antithesis to how I live, how our family understands our place. And so it's been really interesting to do that. But I guess what we're saying to people is like, be a part of this place, but know where you are. Learn, because it's important that you understand the roots. You have to understand what happened on this land where you are being called to pastor. So thank you for doing that. And in the midst of all of this domineering of bodies and control of land, the church still did things. And so, Pastor Gene, talk to us about your little church. Before you do that, I want to say, John Perkins one time asked me, John Perkins is, you all know who he is, maybe most of you know who he is, but he's been a spiritual father to me in many ways. And one time he asked me, how's that little girl? You know, that little girl in Pasadena with the church that built all that. And I'm like, that little girl. Okay. He was talking about her.
Thank you, Myra. Oh my gosh. And I do appreciate now being called a little girl. Yes. When you get older, some things come back around and they make sense to you. Yeah. Marcos, thank you so much. I mean, Myra hit it on the nail. We could sit here and listen to this all day long, but I'm going to tell my little piece of the story, the little girl's piece of the story. I want to quote two people as I'm moving into this. And the first is Peter Dreyer. A number of years ago, he wrote an article called Pasadena's Tale of Two Cities. And in that article, he said, rising rents and home prices are undermining our city's economic, social, and civic fabric. Our public schools are losing children. Many religious congregations are losing members. Youth, soccer, and baseball leagues and other community initiatives are losing volunteers. And that was just a few years ago. I think he wrote that in maybe 2010 or 2009. But then I want to quote something that Ray Bakke, that I really have taken on from one of his books, A Theology as Big as a City, where he says the tension will always be there. The need to spiritually transform persons, the need to socially transform places. Yet there is a sense in which if Christ is with me in the midst of the slum, the neighborhood is a slum no longer. For Christ lives in me, and his kingdom agendas confront the neighborhood. Those two things became sort of the legacy, well, not the first, because the legacy was begun many years prior to Peter Dreyer's document, but this particular thing that Ray Bakke said has just stuck with me. Two of the things that I didn't mention as I was introducing myself, I said I was pastor, but I didn't say that I was the pastor of a small, never grown to be large, and we have grown to accept the fact that God works big with little, and that he is using us to encourage other people not to sit back and wait for the growth in your congregation before you try to do something that makes a lot of sense. And so in 1938, our church was founded, and we've only had 4 pastors since then. My dad was the third, and I'm the fourth and first female. And that's a story for another day. Just a little something is that it was started as Community Baptist Church. It is now Community Bible Church. And you can take that and run with it. This became the legacy of our church. Because when you talk about Northwest Pasadena, you have to know that in the history of Pasadena, that was the place that was known. There were corners in Northwest Pasadena, that there was a corner that was called Cancer Corner. There was the Snake Pit, all of those things, because it was predominantly where Black folks lived who could not afford to live any other place. And they were pushed into a corner of Pasadena. And it's so interesting that, some people say, well, where do you live in Pasadena? Back in the day, you would say, I live in Northwest Pasadena, because that was the stigma that was placed upon you. I remember even as a child, we had an aunt that lived in Northwest Pasadena, and my mother would tell us, we were fortunate and we lived over near the Rose Bowl, because people often forgot that the Rose Bowl is actually in Northwest Pasadena. But in Northwest Pasadena, there are 4 corners and things, and there are places that you would not believe when you hear some of the stories about Cancer Corner and the Snake Pit, that the Rose Bowl also exists there. But we weren't allowed to go to the Snake Pit, and we weren't allowed to go without our parents. If we wanted to visit the cousins that lived over there, Mom would say, well, we'll take you. We can't let you walk there, because there was just too much danger for us to actually walk there. And I said I was raised here in Pasadena, came here when I was 3 years old. All of my siblings were born and here in Southern California. I came from Arkansas. So in our story at Community Bible Baptist Church is the story of housing, is the story of evangelism. I grew up in a home that was a story of evangelism because my dad saw that there were needs for people to be saved and to be brought to Jesus, but he wasn't one of those that would stand behind the pulpit and just yell and scream at them. He also was one of the first 7 Black men that were hired to work in the water and power department for the city of Pasadena. So that was a real big thing for him. And even when he became the pastor, he didn't want to stop working. He wanted to be in the community. Dad used to walk to work from where we lived, and people would stop and say, they called him Rev. Rev, you need a ride? And he'd just throw his head up and say no, because his intent was to run across somebody else that was walking somewhere that he could actually talk to. And the first thing he would ask is, what's your name? And the second thing he would ask is, do you go to church? And that was one of his evangelism tactics. And so one of the others was he started a softball league for churches. And somebody said, well, you're starting for churches. Aren't those all church kids? Well, Dad's idea was they're not all church kids, and some of the best athletes aren't church kids. And so my church kids will go out and encourage their friends who are the best athletes to join our church league. And that would be an opportunity for us to evangelize them. Evangelism was there. Mom was the same way. Mom was a designer, and she would always go to secondhand stores. And one of her great things was, don't just look at something and decide that you want to buy it, but look at the quality of it. Mom would buy stuff that had amazing buttons on it, take those buttons off and turn it around and make something that looked like Ralph Lauren had designed it. But many of my friends would meet her there at the Daisy on Tuesdays and say, your mom is so cool. She's just going to show us how to shop. And she would shop with them. But there was always an opportunity for her to say something about the Lord. And so I grew up in that environment. And in the Black church back then, my mom's family side was Pentecostal, Dad was Baptist. And that's where the Baptist Costal kind of influence comes in. But there was not an evangelism plan. There was no plan for us to go door to door. We didn't want to do that because we knew that there was another group of people that were going door to door, and we did not want to be associated with that. And so we didn't want to go door to door. We would go to the grocery stores and stand out in the parking lot and hand out tracts and things like that. But the evangelism piece for our church and our congregation came when Dr. Coleman, who was the founder of the church, said one day, listen, it's rough over there. And there are so many of our people that don't have places to live except for over there. And we want to do something. Let's do something about the environment in Northwest Pasadena. Let's change the concept of it being Cancer Corner or the snake pit or where somebody's going to get shot or where you're going to buy drugs or where you have a fight and nobody would care because the police often didn't show up when you call them. So he just came up with this idea one day. One of the members of the church back then had a house. He owned property right in the middle of all of that. He sat down and they put their heads together. And this gentleman said, I would be willing to give up my house if we could build something over there. And maybe other people would be willing to do the same thing. And that was the conversation that started. What I didn't say about myself was that I am the president of the Community Bible Community Development Corporation. And so that was the beginning of us building affordable housing for Black folks who had been pushed out of other places in Pasadena. So in 1970, we started our Community Development Corporation. It was at first called the Northwest Pasadena Development Corporation. But we realized later on that if we continued to be the Northwest Pasadena Development Corporation, we might not be able to get as many partners in partnership to purchase other properties. So we changed it. We changed it to the Bible Community Development Corporation. We built, and I'm going to go fast because I know we don't have a whole lot of time, but we built in the early 1970s after much turmoil, because there's no way in the world this small little church should have been able to do what they did. No way we should have been able to go out and find the money. No way should we have been able to go and talk to HUD and say, listen, but we did find out one thing about HUD is that if you guys will do it, we'll help you, because it's not necessarily something that we necessarily really want to do. And so with that, we built in 1970 Community Arms Apartments, 133 units of affordable housing to move the stigma of Cancer Corner and the Snake Pit out of Northwest Pasadena. 133 units of housing. That was amazing. So we had all these families now wanting to live there, and their children wanting to live there, and that they could go there. Now, the legacy of every pastor at Community Bible Church was that you would continue affordable housing while casting your own vision for whatever else you wanted to do. Well, my vision was definitely to continue affordable housing. So we were fortunate enough to be approached by a for-profit developer out of Fresno, California, who came and said one day, I want to purchase this eyesore in Pasadena. And that was called King's Villages. And King's Villages was alongside of our properties, not alongside, but down this, not far from. And so things were happening on that property as well, and they were twice the size. The Lord opened a door for us to become the nonprofit partner in the purchase of King's Villages, which gave us an additional 313 units of property. So the portfolio now has 446 units of property in Northwest Pasadena. And so that has been one of the greatest parts of our legacy. And it gives us an opportunity to zero in on evangelism, because we still have the opportunity to talk to people who are feeling like they don't have as much as other people have, and they're not worth what other people are worth. And so it has been our pleasure at Community Bible Church to, at one time, be the largest provider of affordable housing, and it all was built in Northwest Pasadena. And I don't know, if I go farther, I probably am going to get off, because one of the things that happened, and I do have to say this, Myron, I know we weren't going to go completely into what we have done also with gang violence, but one of the things about gang violence is that many of the people who were coming out of prison knew Community Arms as the Snake Pit. They knew it as Cancer Corner. They knew it as a place where they could go and fight, and so coming home, it was very difficult for them not to contribute to or try to bring back. That was their territory, and so they were coming and claiming their territory when they came out of prison. So it was a difficult thing to believe that we could maintain this without our evangelism piece to expand, to try to minister to those coming out of prison, so that they could be reintroduced to the community. We had one story, and I'll tell this and then I'll pass it on. But we had one story, one little boy. One of the things that we began to do, because we had so many kids coming out of Community Arms and so many kids coming out of King's Villages, that we had one of the largest vacation Bible schools in the city. And everybody wanted to come to vacation Bible school there. And one day we were walking along, and this little boy sitting on a curb, and I walked up to him. His name, well, I won't say his name, but his name was Bobby. And I walked up to him and I said, "Why aren't you inside having fun with all the kids?" And it was right across the street from the King's Villages apartments. And he said to me, he said, "My sisters are in there, and that's enough." And I said, "Well, why is that enough, Bobby?" He said, "Because my dad got killed in King's Villages. And I can't talk to Jesus until I can grow up and kill the person that killed my dad." And so we had all those kinds of things that were happening, and it was an opportunity then, we realized, for us to really get into the trenches and to get into the lives of these families and to create programs that would bring them up and out of what they thought was the only way they could live. And so, my time up?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you for that. And that is why we have to have this conversation of the disembodiment that has happened, is because how do you answer a question like that? how do you communicate the good news to a child who is saying that you cannot give some Christian platitude? Like, it does not work. It did not work. I'm sure that was not yesterday, right? It's a long time ago. Like, didn't work then. It doesn't work now. And so this conversation is so important. So when it makes me crazy as a pastor to hear questions like, what does that have, but what does justice have to do with the gospel? Well, what does justice have to do with any of this, right? So Jill, you're going to talk to us about advocacy, but a question did come in. Somebody wanted to know the relationship between evangelism and justice. And I think in what you're all sharing, but especially with what you're going to share, Jill, I think we'll get to that.
Thank you so much, Mayra. And I just could hear both of these amazing folks on each side of me speak all day. The mission of Jesus was very clear in Luke chapter 4. He came to bring good news to the poor, his first public statement he ever uttered. And then the verses following that outlined how he was to do that. It culminated in what is called the year of the Lord's favor. And all scholars agree that that's Jubilee. And that is where land would be redistributed and returned to the original owner. This has been practiced to some extent throughout history. It's not uncommon, especially for countries in Latin America, to do major land reforms. But who knows if they're thinking that has anything to do with the biblical notion around Jubilee justice in the Bible. But at a local level, what on earth would land reform look like? Years ago, I heard a pastor at a large church here in town unpack that passage in Luke 4. He just did a fabulous job, and I approached him afterwards to thank him. But I asked him a question as well. I said, why did you leave out the gospel message about Jubilee? And his response was, Jill, I want to keep my job. And I was so amazed at that, and I appreciated his honesty. But at the same time, I think if he had realized that every time that we take a home off the speculative market and make it affordable, we are practicing Jubilee. It is a way to create land reform on a very local, meaningful level. So perhaps if he understood that kind of application, realizing that he had an entirely huge parking lot that could be housing, that his church would grow rather than the fear of being kicked out. Churches around the U.S. are catching a vision for providing affordable housing as a ministry of the church, just as Jean has shared. And there's some local, in addition to Jean. Just recently, the Salvation Army has finished 65 units of permanent supportive housing, which is what ends chronic homelessness. Here in Pasadena, we've been able to lower our homeless count by 56%. That is unheard of in Southern California. It's a huge testimony of God's love and grace, as many people over 25, 30 years have been working tirelessly to try to address the crisis. In terms of permanent supportive housing, it's amazing because it's 97% retention rate. That means they don't become homeless again. It's beautiful. So in terms of how this happens, it's a whole collaboration. Martin Luther King used the term the beloved community. He had Jews, he had all kinds of people join his effort. And that's what we do as a nonprofit. We gather up everybody, but especially the church. The church is really, and our understanding of land and a theology of land is what leads us. And we have folks that would say, as I've unpacked the whole theology, as my understanding, I want to expand it now after listening to Pastor Marcos. But when I've written a book on what churches are doing to address the housing crisis, and the most popular chapter in there is the one dealing with a theology of land. And so in looking at that and talking to people of conscience, and as they've heard the story of unpacking a theology of land, they've said to me many times, If that's really what Christians believe, I'd be a Christian, because they see how radical it is and how transformative it is. And so the testimony of providing a tangible and visible asset that is a better use of land. Oftentimes churches have too big of a sanctuary for their current needs. They have buildings they can no longer keep in good shape, deferred maintenance they can't afford to fix, parking lots with weeds growing up. They want to be good neighbors, but they don't have the funding. They don't have a way to do that necessarily. And so when you provide affordable housing, it restores our credibility with our nonprofit status. It gives glory to God, and it serves a critical need in our nation today. The cost of housing today is the biggest purveyor of poverty in our nation. So what we're doing, we've had over 85 churches approach us from throughout Southern California asking us for feasibility studies. We get churches ready to partner with an affordable housing developer. And we have a whole process on how to do that. A number of those churches are here in Pasadena. And in looking at these 85 churches, probably only a third of them have the proper zoning to do this, to make the financials pencil out and make sense to be able to have a developer build housing on their property. And so we got involved in advocacy. We see advocacy as a central theme in Scripture, and it's part of our evangelism. We look at every prophet in the Old Testament as an advocate. If you look at the center and the core of their message, it's always about the poor, about the widow, the orphan, and that's really the message that they spoke to kings and leaders. And so that's a model for us. How do we speak to leaders of our city about justice? And so in terms of our effort, it was a 3-year campaign to rezone churches in our city. Many churches, some of you perhaps were involved in that. It was a huge task and very intense. And so the good news is that it brought people of faith together. It brought people in solidarity and unity. They saw the body of Christ come together around this. The bad news is that what we won was only a handful of churches that are zoned commercially to be able to have the right zoning. And there's only one church of those few that has any interest in doing this. So it was a very limited win. And so we were not deterred. We said, okay, let's keep going. And we decided to go to the state. And so we started building a collaboration of denominations and churches throughout the state. We have over 300 organizations now that we're working with throughout the state. Just recently, finally, after 3 tries, we now have a statewide policy called SB 4, that Senate Bill 4, that rezones every church in the state. Just 3 weeks ago, or maybe 2 weeks ago, Governor Newsom signed it into law. So, amazing. So, in terms of our organization making housing and community happen, I want to mention not only are the Old Testament prophets seen as advocates, and that's the tradition we seek to follow. We also see Jesus as an advocate, seeking to follow in his footsteps. Just in the book of Luke alone, he confronted the authorities 27 times. And he died for our sins, but he also died because he was challenging the system. And at the center of every one of his parables, he always had the most vulnerable. He lifted them to the very center. And that's what we need to do. And of course, the Holy Spirit is called our advocate. I'm going to mention one more story about advocacy and the exponential power of advocacy to produce 100-fold. So a church might build 50 units on their campus. But when you look at policy, you can do thousands of units. And so In 2001, we were able to work with the city and passed the inclusionary. So it's kind of like a biblical tithe or gleaning, leaving some at the edge. And so this requires that every developer of affordable housing, not affordable, every market rate developer set aside a small percent of the housing as affordable. It started with 15%, and in 2019, we were able to strengthen that with a number of churches coming together to testify at the city council. We strengthened that to 20%. Some of you know Westgate. It's a housing just south of Old Pasadena, and that was church property, and it was sold to an affordable housing developer. Or not, I keep saying affordable, I'm sorry, a market rate developer. And I read in the newspaper that they were proposing 800 units. That is a gigantic development, huge. And I thought, how on earth are they going to do that in our city? You know, and so I saw their name. They were a developer out of Irvine. I said, I'd like to meet and talk to you. And they said, oh, sure. They want to meet people in the community. They want to make sure their project gets passed. And so it was very exciting. I explained our inclusionary policy, and they said, what are you going to do? Are you going to include the units, pay a fee, build off site? And they said, we'll probably include the units. And I said, so at what income level? And they said, probably all moderate level. And I said, that's wonderful, but it's not something we can support. We only support those units that are down much lower in helping those that are much lower income. And the majority of workers in our city are at that very low income level. And so I said, think about it, let's get together. In 2 weeks, they decided, this was 10 years before we passed 20%, okay? And they said, we're not going to just do the moderate or the low. We're going to do all the units very low. And we're not going to do the 15% required. We're going to do 20%. This was 10 years before we required 20%. Why on earth would they choose to do that? And it's because of other state policy, our state density bonus law, AB 1818, which gave them more density in exchange for their affordable units. So it basically paid for itself. And so when we see how this policy has produced now over 1,000 units embedded in high-end luxury housing throughout our city that are all affordable, and it's put over $26 million into our city's Affordable Housing Trust Fund in order to produce even more housing. So I'm going to skip talking about rent control and how we were involved in that, and just kind of draw to my conclusion of what I wanted to share, that Jesus, when he stood in the synagogue and he shared his mission in Luke 4, there were some who threw stones and tried to push him off the cliff. But then others, it fell on good seed, and they were willing to hear. And you read about in Acts 2-4 that some were selling land, just like we heard, the person willing to give up their home to produce even more. And so, in Luke chapter 4, it says that they ended poverty among them because they shared. They shared what they had. So can you imagine if churches were committed to ending poverty among them, in their congregation, and in their neighborhood around them? I believe the world would stand up and say, now that is what the church should be doing. And I think we would be like the early church, and we'd be thousands of people coming to Christ. Thank you.
Amen. May it be so. We are going to use the remaining time to take some questions. We had a couple of things we wanted to touch on, but I want to make sure that we look at what has come in. So there's a question about redignifying the land, and Pastor Marcos, maybe you can expand on this a little bit, but maybe you can combine it with this. This question came in Spanish. And the asker says, el problema no está en una justicia realizada a partir de la iglesia. El problema está cuando usamos la justicia como un medio de evangelización. Hay contextos que se escandalizan con eso. ¿Cuál debe ser entonces la relación adecuada entre justicia y el evangelismo? Should I say that in English?
Yes, probably. Just
Okay, the problem is not justice carried out through the church. The problem is when we use justice as a means of evangelization. There are contexts that are scandalized by this. What then should be the proper relationship between justice and evangelism?
sure. If you
Go ahead. I don't see any difference. I think that it's all connected. I think we've segmented all of this, and I don't think Jesus does. I don't think God does. We do that. And that's my response.
the fact that there's more than 500 verses speaking about a God of justice in solidarity and in connection with those that are suffering injustices needs to help us reconsider the kind of God that we've been proclaiming. Because once you understand that the good news is of a God of justice, then at least that's how we talk about it in our congregation in La Fuente, it's an evangelistic justice, right? Like the character of God in being justice, not driven, but justice in God's ethos, in God's essence, is mobilizing enough, should be mobilizing enough for us to reconsider the reconciliation, the restoration of all things. I think when we fall into that dichotomy, when we move the justice conversation away from God's character and essence and action and embodiment in Jesus. And that's where people feel uncomfortable, but it's because they have not heard that that's who actually God is in Jesus, is a justice, it's a display, a revelation of that, right? So that mobilizes us to be salt and light, not in a imperialistic kind of way, but in a collaboration, in a co-laboring with that God of justice, that then really makes people wonder, like all the stories that you guys are like, oh, that's what the church should be. Oh, that's what Christians should be. Oh, because we are in communion with that God who is justice.
I want to follow up on that. I love what you're saying. I have a friend who's an atheist here in town who's doing beautiful work around housing justice. And I've looked at her and I said, you know, you are so Christ-like. She goes, you're kidding. And I said, no, I'm not. I said, you're doing God's work. She goes, I don't believe in God. And I go, I know you don't. But you don't realize that God is using you, your hands, your feet, your heart, your soul is so in line with Christ in so many ways. And she goes, wow, that so blesses me, Jill. Thank you. You know, and so I look at affordable housing developers and I say, you are doing God's work. And they go, we are? I go, absolutely. If you start looking at Leviticus 25, it's all about land use and land reform, and you're doing this work. He says, but we're not faith-based. I said, you're not faith-based, but you don't realize that this is part of God's work in the world. And so we need to partner with you. You've got skills we don't have, and we need you, and you need us. And we've got the land. Churches have the land. You have the skills. And so how do we begin to have a much bigger God that's able to see that God is at work everywhere, all the time, in everyone, and they're all part of God's story unfolding in history? Thanks.
This is such a challenging conversation for me to be a part of. You know, the questions that come around, you know, that we've been hearing again this morning, because as a local pastor, I'm always asking, like, how does this matter to the person who lives on the corner? How does it matter to the little boy who has plans for what he's going to do when he's old enough? You know, like, if it doesn't matter to the single mom, to the unhoused person, to the person who's returning from 20 years of being incarcerated into a community. Like if that doesn't change, we need good news for all of those people, right? And so if it's not good news to them, then it's just not good news, period. I don't care how we frame it or how we think we're going to frame it. And so this is just so hard. Like, so evangelism is our witness. It's our whole witness. Pasadena PD, who I also love, let me just say that. I love police officers in our community. I don't like how things are happening in our country and the genesis of that. But I love police officers as people, and I love the chief who's new. Pasadena PD killed a young Black man in our community in 2020. The people in that park who gathered there every day, and I showed up as much as I could, and other pastors showed up as much as I could during that time at that site. For almost a month, we committed to being there every single day. They just wanted to know who even cares about this? Like, where is the church? If the church is not showing up here and standing with us, then I don't want to hear anything about come to church on Sunday. So like and they're telling us this. They're not even like, we don't have to wonder. Like the people are actually saying, like, how does this even matter for me? And what just happened down the block from me or outside of my window? So it is critical. Like if we're really talking about people knowing the good news, we have to communicate it in a way that they can see and feel it in their lives, right? That's our task. Pastor Jean and actually anybody else, but I would love to hear from you what this has looked like in terms of, what we heard about some of the Western models and metrics that have been used and, for evangelization and church growth and all of that, and what that has looked like for your church, and then also like how the pandemic has impacted that and what you've learned.
Thank you. I almost want to go directly to the impact that the pandemic has had. It's really interesting to me that the pandemic created a level playing field as such for all of the churches because our doors all had to shut at the same time. They had to close the doors, and people were complaining about, we can't go to church, we want to go to church, we want to go to church. But then when the doors were opened again, many of those people complaining about how they were going to miss church and how they couldn't live without church didn't come back to church. And I think one of the conversations that I've had with so many of the pastors in the CCC too is that we all now have something in common, is that we have smaller churches. And what are we doing with those smaller churches? And it's so interesting to me, and I said this to someone not too long ago, that we built Community Arms with a congregation of about 50 people. That was many, many, many years ago. And so we called ourselves the little church that could, I think I can, I think I can, I think I can. Until we got to the top of the hill, and then we said, we know we can, and we did it. And it's been something that we have celebrated throughout our history. And so here we are now with a smaller congregation, not much larger than the congregation that built Community Arms. And we have this challenge to build out something else. And I started thinking, wow, God, you really do move in smaller environments, don't you? I mean, it can't be that we are so consumed with the fact that we've got to go back now to the growth. We've got to figure out how to do evangelism. We got to get out there. We got to do this. We got to grow the church. But you know what we saw is that God grew a church, a small group of people who believed in him and who had the faith to know that they could. And I think that that's one of the things that we all now have in common is we still have this same big God. My sister always says, God is too big to do little. God is too big to be little, but he uses little to do big. And so that's sort of a concept that we've taken on too. And so, I think about, and I have to just say this too, that we no longer own the Kings Village's property. We sold it, but we took that money and bought other properties so that we can have more properties. And so I just wanted to put that out there. But but I think that we have to remember too, Mayra, that the CCC was founded around the issue of housing. When we came together as churches were smaller at that time. And the thing about the African American churches, and Marcos and I talk about this, and the Latino churches, is that they began to become much smaller before the pandemic. And so when the pandemic came on, smaller got smaller. And so, I think that the thing that the church has to always be willing to do is to be the witness that a big God loves the people and can do things for the people, through the people, if the people are willing to trust in the big God.
Thank you. There is one question that we've kind of answered. I think we have, but I just want to put it out there because these are really important questions. They take our time, and we have them in academia. Let me just tell you what the question is. Did your efforts at Justice translate into church expansion?
That's Pastor Dean right there. We talked about
It did for a while. It did for a while because everybody was so excited, especially when the guys were coming home from prison. We started another group called The Positive Force. These guys said, listen, some of us are coming home, and we realized while we were incarcerated for 25 years, 15 years, 10 years, that we were part of the big problem. One of the nation's largest gangs was founded in Pasadena. And so we are coming out of prison. We want to come home, and we want to do something that will help us to keep our children from doing the same thing that we did. And they said, well, we want to be a positive gang. So we want to start a group called A Positive Gang. And I looked at them and said, you know what, guys? There's nothing positive about a gang in Pasadena. So you can't name yourselves gang. I said, what you want to do is become a force. So let's call you a positive force. So they became a force. Group of men, at any given Sunday, you would see 15, 10, 25 men in the conference room. When you come down, you would think it's a men's meeting, but no, it's not a men's meeting. It's a meeting of those who just came out of prison, and they're sitting around trying to figure out what they can do to impact the community and to keep their kids from becoming who they were. And so I think that from that we started growing and growing and growing. So the church grows. I think for our church, it grows in seasons. And when God's about ready to do something big through us, the church shrinks. So I told my congregation not too long ago, we're shrinking, guys. Watch out, because something big is on the horizon.
I long for the day where the question becomes, how have your efforts at Justice brought about shalom in the community? Can people see shalom in this community? And maybe the person who asked the question was not thinking church expansion in the traditional sense, like more bodies and seats on Sunday and bigger buildings, but did the community of faith expand because of what they witnessed, right? So we are actually out of time, but I do want to give maybe 1 minute each, because I just give away minutes. Just to do a wrap up, and also because we have like 20 minutes before lunch. So go ahead. So go ahead, Jill.
Yeah. So just in response to that last question, I'm a dissertation supervisor for someone. We're doing a dissertation on church land, and he studied churches around the country. And I'm working closely with another gal who just finished her PhD in this. And so they've really asked that question. Is it causing the church to grow? And again, I agree with the question. It needs to be adjusted. Mm-hmm. All these churches have grown in tremendous impact. Now, have they grown in size? Right. That may not be the case. All churches are shrinking today, for the most part. Right. Congregations. Mm-hmm. Thank you. And so anyway, but I just feel so honored and privileged to be with you today and to share what God has done in and through us, and invite you to be part of the change. We may not be able to build on your church land, but you can all be advocates. And I'll tell you, when the church shows up at the city council, and when Tyrone, my city council person, when I sit down and share with him a theology of land, he says, Jill, that's so good. Just tell me one more time. I love hearing you. Just tell me one more time. He soaks it up. because we're involved at the city level and they're catching a glimpse of what God wants to do in cities. And that's evangelism. That's saving not just our souls and our churches, it's saving the whole city.
Amen. It's hard to follow up with any of that. Yeah, I mean, I think just I'll speak to the context that I am a part of and I belong. I think for me, Latina congregations in the U.S. Are being tempted and are being tempted to measure their faithful witness with the metrics of white evangelicalism, which have proven to be contested and deficient. So I feel like that evangelism is one of those areas where the Latina church could be tempted to replicate its expansion language, which is colonial language, right? So for me, I think that the shrinking, right, the small, to not overlook that. And I think specifically with the Latina church as a transnational church, because what happens in Guatemala affects LA Guatemalans and the Latina church that has those Guatemalans, and you could go in like that throughout the whole continent. Just because there's masses and just because there's numbers, it doesn't mean that that's the metric we need to use. And so I think the crisis of our witness should lead us to revisit pastoral leadership and what is really our role. Because it is not, we know it's not in methodology, we know it's not in expansion, but it is really as to how do we become better, I don't know if detectives is the word, but it's more of like, oh, that's kingdom of God stuff. Oh, that's what you're doing right there. I know you're just selling tamales, but selling tamales so that your community down in fill in the blank has running water. That is good news, right? Versus us trying to hoard it or trying to measure how it looks in our specific Sunday gatherings. So how do we diffuse that? And how do we have how do we heal our imagination of what does it mean for actually good news to be not only proclaimed verbally, but embodied and actually accompanied through the whole 20, 30-year process of what it takes sometimes.
Thank you.
And with this, Ronald Sider, who is the author of Churches That Make a Difference, says this, and I think that it goes with all that we're ending with, and that is conflict can open the door to dialogue, which can give clarity to a new holistic understanding of the church's mission. And I think that that's where we are. We're in a place and a space now where God is up to something.
Yeah, amen. One of the things that we take really seriously at the Clergy Community Coalition is rootedness. Like everything that Pastor Marcos shared, we want to make sure that every person who's clergy, every faith leader is really considering, calling to a specific place. And so we talk about, so at every CCC meeting that we do every month, we have a time where we call it the pastor's pulse. And so different pastors will come and talk to us about leadership, encouragement, exhortation, whatever. They'll bring a word. And that really has become the favorite time for our city leaders. It's a moment where they're actually pastored and encouraged. And we just don't shy away from saying, hey, this is who you are. This is how we see you. This is the role that you're in. And it really matters that you're here. We care about the land. We want to encourage you. And we also want to challenge you. And so sometimes it can get a little uncomfortable in the room when we're all together talking about things that we may not agree on, policies, ordinances, policing, whatever. It does get uncomfortable. But we stay at the table and we challenge folks. Right now we have a new city manager, a new police chief, a new HR director for the city, a fairly new fire chief, actually a bunch of assistant city managers that are new. And when we looked at the list last January, we're like, all of these people are people of color. And it really matters. And so I think I think I actually did that pastor's pulse in January when I said, I see you, I see what you look like. Can we show a different way of doing things? You know, as you represent these different areas of the city, I know that you have to represent all people in the city, but can we center, as people of color, can we center the most marginalized in this community? Can we actually do that together? And sometimes, sadly, the answer has been no. And I think 2019, was it, Sean, when Dr. Jennings was here and said something like, you ain't got to be white to be white? 17? Okay. You ain't got to be white to be white, and we're talking about whiteness here, you know, and these are the things that we've heard today, have the narratives that have controlled the cultural things that bind us to continue to perpetuate communities where some people are pushed out. But can we actually be a people that change that?
And the city.
They cut us off. They're like, you need to start talking.
Okay, I don't need a microphone.
There you go. Y'all can leave if you want to. You can leave if you want to.
Like the city leaders don't leave without prayer. So we are praying for them as well.
Right. Pastor Marcos?
Yeah, just the last thing that I forgot to mention too is that when talking about evangelism, don't forget about the people that are moving, that are migrating into our communities, right? Because the objectification of migrant communities, refugees, like what does it mean for Venezuelans, Cubans, and Nicaraguans that are seeking asylum and that are moving about and trying to enter into our country, which is the three most, the most numerous immigrant groups that are trying to get in? What does that mean? Because they are also carriers of the good news that perhaps the North American church has lost, right? So instead of methodology, how do you change your posture to welcome and be transformed versus helping, right? So people that have always been in movement, that's why I told you that whole history, because there was always movement of people in this land. It's just how do you respond to that movement that makes the gospel evident or actually toxic? So also be aware of that.
Amen. Thanks for hanging in there with us.